Um, when we've been going through these, thank you by the way, while we've been going through these books of the Bible, and we're doing Philemon and Galatians as we have done in the past, we've kind of took them verse by verse, and it's a very good way to proceed, I think, because then you get all these things in context. You know, you get to see how an argument builds, like with Philemon. You know, you get to hear Paul's very sort of natural progression through the letter. With Galatians, he's building up an argument as he's going. So it's a very good way of understanding verses and putting them in context, because there's a kind of natural building up of the argument. Mm. With James, it's a little bit different. I don't know if you've noticed this, that what he seems to do is, as you're reading through it, he'll take a point and maybe expand it for a few verses, and then he seems to actually leave it and go on to something else. And then you find as you're going through the book, maybe like a chapter later, he'll come back to the point again. And so it's far more disjointed in the way it's presented. And there's some people who've said that it's actually a kind of technique, a way of Hebrew preaching. You know, there's different types of preaching, and that it's actually quite a traditional Hebrew way of teaching, that sometimes these rabbis would take their time to kind of draw out certain, you know, gems of wisdom, and it would almost be like as if they're disjointed. So, you know, it would just simply be laying one kind of thought after another, not necessarily building an argument. So it would be more like preaching rather than a letter, like an epistle as we would understand it. And so you get these gems of wisdom, and yet when you put them all together, there seems to be slightly disjointed. Can anyone think of another book in the Bible that does something similar to that, where these things are presented and yet they just seem to be one after another and not necessarily Proverbs? Yeah, that's what I thought of. You know, Proverbs is very much like that, isn't it? You know, you start reading through. I mean, apart from say the first, I don't know, 3 or 4 chapters of Proverbs, you know, you start getting into it, and it seems to be almost disconnected, don't they? And it's just one thing after another. And you know, to a certain extent, with Ecclesiastes, in the same way, you know, a time for this, a time for that. You know, Solomon is saying, you know, you know, what is laughter? What is mirth? You know, it's madness. And then he talks about, you know, what is wine? And so it seem to be all disconnected kind of things. But some have suggested that it's actually a method of preaching that they have. In fact, you know, if you have a very old Bible and you go to Ecclesiastes, I don't know if you might have it in yours, Paul, but in the old King James Bible, it's not in this one I've got a really old one, and it says Ecclesiastes, and then there's an alternative title for that book.
Oh,
have you seen that? No, it says Ecclesiastes or The Preacher.
Oh.
Because and I was quite surprised when I read it, because you'll say that, yeah, or the Preacher.
Oh, the Preacher.
Yeah, because it starts off in the first or second verse, I think it talks about the preacher. And it's just interesting, isn't it? That it seems to be some kind of literary technique. So whilst we're going through it verse by verse, and it's helpful to do that, at times you think, well, what's the connection between these few verses and the next ones? You know, and is it David Pawson says that it's a technique called Kazakh. Now I've heard of Kazakh. Anybody heard of? No, Kazakh. I'm not entirely convinced that is Kazakh. Kazakh is a Hebrew word, and I thought it was more a kind of like an exclamation. For example, they reckon that, you know, when they were learning the Torah, that you come to an end of a book, say like Leviticus, and they have to like the Pharisees would learn the Pentateuch, and then they would repeat them sort of verbatim. That when you come to the end of the book, you sort of say Kazakh, or you shout Kazakh, and it's a bit like sort of, come on, you know, like I think it literally means something like be a man, be of good strength, you know, this kind of phrase, but he says, David Pawson says, that it refers to this kind of preaching. I don't know, but I just thought I'd throw it in there because I thought it was interesting, and you see it repeated in other books of the Bible, so it would seem to suggest that it is a technique that was used, you know. I want to start as well just by reminding ourselves of something as we go through these verses, from verse 19, that James is an apostle, and that as such he has a certain authority. As an apostle, you know, that's sometimes forgotten. People talk about Paul and Peter, and they understand that they have this apostolic authority, but James also has that. And I read an interesting quote from A.W. Tozer that I thought I'd just share with you with regard to the writings of the apostles. And Tozer says this. He says, the exhortations in the epistles are to be understood as apostolic injunctions, carrying the weight of mandatory charges from the head of the church. They are intended to be obeyed, not weighed as bits of good advice, which we are at liberty to accept or reject at will. Now, people do weigh them in that way quite often, I think. And he's saying, no, they are apostolic injunctions. They are commandments, which we are not at liberty to dismiss. If you're a Christian, then we must consider these carefully. Okay, so verse 19, we read, "Be swift to hear, and slow to speak, and slow to wrath." And it reminded me of some of the writings in Proverbs. In the multitude of words there wanteth not sin, but he that restraineth his lips is wise. Proverbs 10:19. And he that is soon angry dealeth foolishly. You get a lot of this sort of stuff in Proverbs, don't you, about being hasty when you say things, and being soon angry, you know, given to wrath. And I was just wondering whether anybody could think of any occasions in the Bible where hasty words bring, you know, regrettable situations or even foolish outcomes. Anything that anybody can think of where someone's words have resulted in you know, saying something hastily has resulted in a tragedy or a difficult situation.
Oh yes, I can actually. Yeah, I'm thinking now of Nadab.
Nadab?
Yeah.
Go on.
You know the occasion where David was looking after Abigail and Nadab,
Yes.
the sheep,
Yes.
and David asked for, I think, what was it? You asked this for some favour from Nadab.
Yes.
Nadab made this outburst. Who am I to help this fugitive?
Yes.
And it resulted in David he was going to kill him.
Yes,
And
that's right.
fortunately Abigail intervened.
Abigail intervenes on his behalf, yeah.
So, and I think Nadab actually means something like it had
Foolish or something.
foolish speech or something like that. Yeah. Yeah. But in terms of making hasty statements, I can look at my own life and give you countless examples of where that's got me in trouble.
Yes.